Today's topic is childism. Some people may know it as adultism, but for the purpose of our group and it's also the definition in the dictionary and everything. Childism is an oppression against children. So we're going to use the word childism to mean oppression against children. So I just wanted to start with a really quick definition that comes from an article by Chester Pierce and Gail Allen from 1975. Childism is the automatic presumption of superiority of any adult over any child. It results in the adult's needs, desires, hopes, and fears taking unquestioned precedence over those of the child. And that usually looks like, how we're affording the child dignity and respect. And it's not usually an overt or explicit like violence or maltreatment against a child. It's usually a microaggression on the part of the adult. So what it usually leads to is lowering a child's self-esteem, their dignity, and their worthiness. So it's just kind of a quick definition. We also will be posting a link to a blog post that kind of puts it into some perspective, which I think is really accessible for people. But in terms of like scholars and research, this paper is actually one of the first ones that really started to bring this idea to people's consciousness. So it's from 1975. I'm gonna try and share it, but it is, there's copyright protection and stuff, so I have to figure that out. But Connie, did you have anything you wanted to add or ask?
No, let's go through like your notes of it and then I'll ask questions.
Okay, so that was the what. The why, as with all oppressive systems, racism, sexism, all these other types of oppressive systems, they're to make the aggressor feel good. And it kind of goes against what, research tells us about raising children, is that children need guidance and support. But childism it goes against that. So the other thing to note about childism is that parents generally, and adults in general, we're victims of it themselves because it is something that is part of society. It's not, just this group over here, that group over there. It's pretty all encompassing. Chester Pierce has a couple of very specific, there's about 10 specific examples of the operation of childism, and I'm just going to point out two of them. So one of them is the child must accept confinement or immobility at the convenience of the adult. So an example of that would be stop running around when I have a headache. And another example is the child is expected to conform to the adult's timetable in his progress towards maturity and independence. So that could be, holding people back or pushing them too fast for the convenience of the adult. And the effects of childism, as I said before, self-esteem and things like that. But children who are victims of childism, pretty much all of us, are conditioned to think that being good means being powerful and right. So, the parent is powerful and right. So, if I'm receiving negative reactions from my parents, tyranny or terror or microaggressions, that's because I've failed to please the powerful person. And so children are conditioned to accept that as part of like life. What it results in is peer conflicts, low self-esteem, etc. And craving attention, lessened ability to share, greater unwillingness to cooperate, and a sharper focus on what cannot be done will characterize their peer interaction. So then this is where you end up with a lot of times children becoming bullies to their peers, because it's an outlet, a way for them to maintain some control over their life if they're experiencing, you know, these microaggressions at home. And then so that article is really I think sort of introduction to childism. And yeah, just quickly, so he actually makes this really, I think, really important statement. And I think a lot of people may find it kind of polarizing. People might find it really that angers them, perhaps because, you know, there maybe there's some guilt, some shame, some denial. But children are the most oppressed group and the most easily oppressed group. So I think that's a really powerful statement. It's actually a statement that I opened my final research paper with when I wrote about educational trauma. That was the statement that started my whole paper. And so one of the other people that did a lot of research and a lot of contribution to the discussion around childism is Elizabeth Young Bruhl. And so one of the articles, she has a book, but I ended up only having access to her one article called Childism, Prejudice Against Children, which is pretty blunt, direct statement. And, you know, just I'm just quickly run through some of her ideas. I know this is probably not the most engaging section of this conversation, but it's just to establish a bit of a base of where I'm coming from with this, you know, this information, this education that I have in terms of, you know, what childism is. So Elizabeth Young Bruhl says that the adults claim that children are owned and can be indoctrinated as adults wish. And another thing that she made a distinction, because she's a psychoanalyst, was that she was hearing all of these stories from children that were not necessarily stories of violence or abuse, but, you know, again, these microaggressions. And so she was like, you know, I was a child once, and how come I'm not hearing my own experience? Because she was starting to see a pattern that these things were happening to every child that she had encountered, that this was sort of a thing. And she had this interesting, as a writer, this interesting voice of, you know, not only someone writing and researching about it, but someone who's also a victim of it herself once she finally started to dig into that. And so she basically states that we've all had non-abusive character shaping experiences from when we were children. And they were usually obsessional, hysterical, or narcissistic prejudices against children. And this kind of actually brought up for me this something that we see that's totally acceptable in our society are these gated communities that you find where children are not allowed. And I think it's crazy to think that this is acceptable, because if you were to say people only white people are allowed in this community, there would be an uproar and there would be protests and there would be people fighting against that. But because it's children, it's acceptable. Do you have any thoughts on that?
First, I wanted to even address like this whole concept of childism, because I think as a society, we believe, you know, it's very obvious, like in what you're saying, that we think that children are less than adults, like less valuable than adults. Therefore, they should listen to adults, and that adults know best, right? And I think as a parent, you know, like it's kind of crazy to recognize that childism is something that we grew up with. Then we also you know, do it ourselves as parents, but also like in our like interactions, like everyday kind of interactions, like the stereotypes we have around like children that are misbehaving at the park, or like teens in a store, like we were talking about. And it's actually super prevalent, but never talked about.
Yeah, and I think that's the most surprising thing for me is how, and I think a lot of it is explained really well. And I'm not going to talk about Alice Miller too much, but in her book, For Your Own Good, which I will also provide a link for, because I think it's important for people who are interested in this to read that book. The idea that, oh my goodness, I totally lost my train of thought. But she makes some really good points about forgetting and almost this like sense of like, denial, and people really feeling, like, well, it's my turn now, I get to exert power over someone now. And I think as a parent, if you are falling into this trap of, well, it happened to me when I was a kid and I'm fine, the question I would be asking myself is, are you though? Are you really able to rise above all the traumas you experienced as a child? Because one of the defense mechanisms children have against these kinds of things is it's all psychological, because they don't have the power to rise up and protest and fight against their oppressor. So what ends up happening is it's the defenses are all inside. And so that's when people talk about childhood trauma, and I find kind of on the internet collectively people talking about childhood trauma as if only some people experienced it, or only people who are really, really damaged experienced it, like as if trauma is this super powerful, only happens to people who are abused or whatever. But that's not true. Trauma, it takes the form of so many little things, like even little things like microaggressions. So I think everybody has childhood trauma. I mean, there are obviously going to be people that had really secure attachment with their parents and had parents that were very responsive, very supportive, broke the cycle. A lot of people, have experienced these things as children. They go on to be parents and decide like, this isn't how I'm going to raise my children. And that's great. But I think generally we kind of forget what's happened to us, because it's also mixed in with this love we have for our caregivers. So we kind of forgive them and we give them this like grace of like, well, they took care of me and they raised me and I'm grateful. So I'm going to forgive all those other things, or I'm going to forget, I'm going to put it behind me. But what happens is people don't resolve it. People don't really actually take the time to acknowledge it and we've talked about this before, where it's like I feel bad about saying something negative about my parents or something that they did that I didn't like, because it almost feels like we're betraying them, or that we're being ungrateful for what they did for us. But I think it's okay to have those thoughts and be able to be like, I still love my parents, but I don't agree with how this went. And I understand that they were just doing the best they could with what they were given, what tools they were given from childhood. So when you can take that, look at it from that perspective, then I think then it makes it easier for you to accept that, sure, these things happen to me, but I'm not going to let it keep continuing through my ancestry, through my children and my children's children.
Yeah, and I think that's when we first started talking about the parenthood revolution and what it was going to mean, it was this idea of parents healing their own stuff so they could stop passing it on to their children. But also for you, it was also helping to educate people on childhood development and how children don't have the capacity as adults do to form, logical or take themselves out of the step out of it, in the sense of if their parent is yelling at them, they take it personally because they don't have the capacity to distinguish that the parent isn't yelling at them, it's their own stuff coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a huge thing for the parenthood revolution is the personal development of the parents, and also understanding that there's children, children are developing differently, and yet we can all grow together.
Yeah, and that actually, go back to Alice Miller, she does say that, and it was something that I included in my paper as well, was this idea that we're growing together. And some people, especially adults, don't like to accept that, we're still growing alongside our children. So it's like this like little dance that we do with our kids as they're growing. We learn about ourselves, and then this reciprocal relationship. But a lot of people tend to try and resist that idea of, I'm the adult, I already know everything. What can I learn from my kids? Because they don't know anything. They're less than. How can they teach me something when I'm the grown up? And that's a pretty dangerous, way of thinking in terms of like, providing secure attachment for your children, and sort of breaking the cycle of childism. So one of the other things that Elizabeth Young-Bruhl kind of points out is that usually prejudices are focusing on an outgroup. But the difference here for children, and sometimes, and a lot of times with women as well, when we talk about sexism, is that they're not other, they're not an outgroup, because they are us, we were them. So this idea of being, having this oppressive mentality towards children is kind of a strange concept, because we're doing something to somebody who we were, like, where we came from. It's not like this is, we're being oppressive to like men oppressing women, or racism, oppressing people of color. That is complete, is not the case with childism. We're oppressing our own selves, basically. And then what ends up happening is that children become targets for the unresolved traumas in adults, which I think I meant, like, kind of said in a not as eloquent way. And then she also has an interesting quote here that what usually is the case with childism is that adults want from children what they wanted as children. And usually that's love, but sometimes it does take the form of hatred and punishment. And then, she kind of pulls society into it as well. She's not just saying, individual people are the problem. No, it's society that, and society, so social and political conditions that are not fostering or allowing people to achieve maturity psychologically. And those are the conditions that are conducive to childism. So she says, when a society, for whatever reasons, cannot promote maturity, it becomes childist. So it's really it's a big thing, and we see this with all the other prejudices for other groups, is that it is a social issue that needs everybody to be on board, and everybody has to affect that change. We do have people that want to make changes, and they do, and they do their part to break the cycles and things. But for it to completely disappear, everybody has to start making an effort. And the other thing she kind of points out about childism with regards to children is that people kind of tend to see children as future overthrowers of their parents. And so that could be another reason why people have this mentality towards children, is that, they're kind of jealous of their youth, jealous that they get, to be in the future. They get this, to be part of a future society that we will not be around for. And I think it causes a lot of insecurity in people. And she also, points out, and so this kind of explains that social aspect, and why society is kind of slow on the uptake here, is that before there was all this extensive research, which was probably only within the last 100 years about children, is that the maltreatment of children was actually seen as normal and necessary and righteous. So there's still that kind of ingrained in society, and you'll see a lot of it in classrooms as well. This idea of like, you need to conform or you don't get the good grades, or you're seen as a disruptor of the classroom. Your behavior isn't falling in line with what I expect, rather than this child needs my guidance and I need to be supportive. And So, and then the other distinction, the other thing, like the who, what, where, when, why, how kind of questions. Who are the people, that are inflicting these prejudices on children? It's not people they don't know. It's people they do know, and it's people that they love. So you can understand why, Alice Miller would say something like, you know, well, I love my oppressor because they're my, what else are you supposed to do? You rely on them for everything. You rely on them for shelter, for food, for, so it's this kind of almost Stockholm syndrome. So that's mostly all my notes for that.
I wanted to ask, like, how does childism show up, like examples in everyday life? Like in the article that you referred to in the beginning, um, the the author is talking about how she's going for a haircut. She cut it like all off. And the whole time the hairdresser was like looking to her husband, like, are you sure? Are you sure that is this a good length? How about this? And then the author says, now what if we make that person me as a child, and how we as adults will be like, are you sure? Like talking about a child as if they're not in the room.
Yeah.
So what are some other examples? Because I said so is like a big one of like us just trying to be like, we're the parent, you're the child, and this is how it is, right? But what other examples can you give?
So I know a lot of people are probably going to get mad at me when I say this, but piercing a baby's ears takes away a person's bodily autonomy. I will circumcision. My children are circumcised, but had I known what I know now, then I likely wouldn't have. But so bodily autonomy things, cutting a child's hair without asking them what they want, things that are like, or food. The other example that the author brings up is asking the parent if the child is hungry. That seems ludicrous if you were to do that to an adult. So, you and I are at a table at a restaurant, and the waitress says to me, "Oh, what does your friend want to have?" Isn't that ridiculous? Of course, you want your children to eat healthy things, and you're not going to be like, "Yeah, they can have ice cream for dinner." No, but you should include your child in the conversation of things that affect them in their body, what they're putting into their body, what is happening to their body. So that's an everyday thing. Another example would be oh boy, there's lots of things we do where we don't give reasons for why we're doing things and just expect the child to toe the line. If someone said to you, you need to go over there and you need to take all your clothes off. I don't know why that came to mind. It's just like, for example, someone's making you wants you to do something. You are like, no, thank you. I don't want to do that. And you're like, well, why? And they're like, because I said so. Or because I asked you to, or, without saying, well, because you've been quarantined and we need to remove your dirty clothes or your infected clothes, then you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'm gonna do that because I want to protect myself. I want to be safe. But if someone were to ask you to do that without giving you a proper reason or logical reason, or some like, well, I'm fearful for your safety, then you're not going to want to do it, and you're going to be feeling like you are unimportant and your feelings don't matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And it goes back to our conversation that we were having before this of, so when a child is, 2 and they have been introduced to sugar and that's all they want to eat, right? So in this sense of how do we as parents balance this like idea of giving our children autonomy and being sovereign, but also doing what's right for them? So like in that case, right, a 2-year-old that's like, I want ice cream. They can't actually go and get the ice cream and whatever. So it's easier to manage that. But a 7-year-old that can open the freezer and get their own bowl and eat ice cream all day, even though like as parents, we're like, I don't want you to eat sugar, right? And like, okay, so we're just going to pretend like as if, whatever, like we could just not have the sugar in the house. But like in that kind of example where a child is old enough to do the things they want and they want to do the things they want. And as parents, if we're just like, you can't eat ice cream all day long because I said so, right? Like, how do we balance this like dynamic of the parent that actually like has the life knowledge and skills and experience where the child may not just wants to do it because they want to and because whatever, like it tastes good or they just want to, right? But allowing them to be sovereign and like
So
have
the
their own say.
so the autonomy in
Mm.
something like that is what you're talking about, I think. I think in order for, for you to be able to say that child, not right now, um, there has to be already an established relationship of trust. So the importance of building a really strong connection with your child through their early years um, means that they trust you. So if you say something to your child, they're going to listen because they know that you mean what you say and you say what you mean. If you are ambiguous at all, if you are dishonest, if you use tricks to get your kids to fall in line, those are not conducive to emotional intelligence. So let's say, for example, a 3-year-old wants to eat ice cream. If you are working on building a relationship with that 3-year-old, obviously you can this is kind of a bigger conversation. That's actually that example has so many different facets to it, but it really does boil down to trust. Like I know for my son, was having issues with a teacher at school and not wanting to do what the teacher asked him or told him to do, or whatever her side of the story was. His side of the story was she wanted me to do something that I didn't want to do. And I said, well, why do you listen when I tell you to do stuff? And he goes, because you're mom and I know you have a good reason for saying it. So we built a relationship, like a relationship built on trust. So if I say to my son, don't do that, or I need you to go brush your teeth, or, whatever it is that I've asked him to do, he does it because he knows that my intentions are good or that they're genuine, that I do it from love, a place of protection, wanting to have him safe and healthy. So I think that's kind of answering your question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so it's about like being like building more connection and relationship. And that's what I think this comes down to. It's just like parents recognizing that children are humans, or even people, society recognizing that children are humans as well and have their own like thoughts and emotions and everything, just as adults do, and that they're not less than us because we're adults.
Also, they want the same things as us. They want to feel love. They want to feel safe. They want to feel connection. They want those things. When a child resorts to negative behaviors, it's because they're lacking in one of those things. They want positive attention more than negative attention. But if the only attention they get is negative, then they're going to do things to get any attention at all. So what we need to do is create positive experiences for them, just by being present, being transparent. I mean, you don't have to tell your child every detail of your life. If you're having a bad day, you don't have to say, well, my boss did this and this happened on the train. And, all like, you just need to say, you know what, mom's having a really, emotional day. I feel really sad. I feel really tired. I can't play with you. Like, I can't play that game with you right now. But if you give me a couple of hours to calm myself down, calm my body down, then we can play. So giving real reasons for your decisions. And like I said, you don't have to include them in all of the details, but if you're honest with them about why you can't do something, or why, like the headache example, you can still ask a child not to run around the house because you have a headache, but there's a way of doing it. There's a proper way to approach that situation. And part of that is being reflective and mindful as an adult and a parent, of saying to the child, hey, I know you're really excited because you're home and you want to play. Could you go play outside for a little while instead, while mommy, needs to take some medicine for my headache, and once my headache is gone, you can come back, you can come back in and we'll do something together, or whatever. So you don't have to, neglect your own needs as an adult. You definitely, that's not what people are asking you to do when they say, don't be a child, like don't, participate in childism. No one's saying that. No one's saying give your child complete, control over your household. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is that you need to include them as valuable members of the household. So, if you're in a relationship with someone, you and your partner are equals, and you communicate with each other. The same thing should be happening with your kids. Obviously, it's going to be age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. You're not going to tell your 2-year-old, like, I had a bad day, please don't, do whatever. You're gonna have to use a different approach. You may have to use redirection. You may have to use distractions, but there's no need to, be oppressive with, the way you do things, and using microaggressions to basically create obedient children, because that's not what we want. We don't want obedient children. We want emotionally intelligent children who do those things because they want to do those things, because they love you and they want to be a valuable member of the family, and they want to contribute.
Yeah, and I think that circles back to what you were saying earlier that I wrote a note about. You were talking about how everybody has to start making the effort. And I think that's where, us as parents and adults, we can start looking at our own stuff and seeing where in childhood we were feeling like we were lacking, or, start looking at those things that need to be healed and start healing them so that we're not like passing them on.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a topic that, I think we can have a few different parts to cover. But I think, in terms of an introduction, it really does boil down to, taking account, kind of holding yourself accountable, taking responsibility for your own actions, and then, reflecting, looking at your own traumas and trying to, figure out a way to, you don't have to resolve them completely, but how do you fit them into your life as a parent? How are you going to do for your children, where something that you were lacking as a child? Like we spoke about this. I was the first child. My dad was very, very young. I didn't have a very close relationship with my dad. So I have, this need to give more than I received to my children. Like I want to, but I don't overdo it. So that, because there's like, these two sides of it where you get those like helicopter parents and those lawnmower parents, because they're trying to overcompensate for something that they were lacking as a child. There is a good middle. There's a middle ground that it is kind of a balancing act, but we should be, as adults, able to manage it to, for the most part, fairly successfully if we're prepared to put in the effort. I think sometimes childism is a result of people not either understanding or knowing what to do instead, and so they just fall back on what they experience as children because it's what they know. If you don't know the better way, you don't know what the other side of it is, you're just going to default to the way you were brought up.
Yeah, and I think one other thing I wanted to touch on is something that we were talking about in our conversation before we went live, about how I was saying, out in public when there are parents with like multiple children. Actually, I was at a store one night and there was like a parent, they had a cart full of like kids. So it was like a bunch of young kids. So there's probably like 4 kids and most of them wanted to run around the store. And of course, like, as a parent, we have no idea like what has happened and like transpired throughout the whole day. But then of course they were frustrated that their children were running in all different directions and terrorizing the store, you know. And you made a really good point about not overextending yourself as a parent. So do you want to like expand on
Yeah.
that?
I know, sometimes we get we have these great intentions, like we're gonna, go and include my kids in the daily shop or the weekly shop, or we're gonna go to the park, even though, it's very close to nap time, or, for whatever reason, you do something that it's almost going to set you up for failure in terms of like, emotions or behaviors from your children. And, as the parent of that child, you know what their limits are, and pushing them past those limits is really a recipe for disaster. So if you know that everybody's exhausted, don't take them to a restaurant, get takeout. Like, or if you know that, you know your 4 kids are going to run around the store and it's going to cause you more stress than is something that you're prepared to handle, because you're what your boiling point is. And I know this is not always easy for people, especially if you're a single parent, or you've only got one car, and you need to, someone needs to drive you, so then everybody has to go or whatever. And we've seen this in pandemic where, the whole family goes shopping, which to me is just asking for trouble if you've got all of your family at the grocery store and exposing yourself to potential virus. But when you think about it, not everyone has the ability to do click and collect, but if you can, make your life easier, simplify your life. Don't try and do everything all at once. And I think sometimes that happens because as parents, we get so excited that we get to include our children in all of our favorite pastimes, like skating or skiing or whatever. And they may not be actually like developmentally ready for those things. So we need to do it in smaller doses, perhaps. Maybe don't do it for so long, or don't do it at a bad time of the day, or, pick a time where there's less people, or, so you just be really, really intentional about those kinds of experiences or those things. Like, I know that it's not always possible. I'm not suggesting that, people have the ability to just, make those choices. Sometimes you have no choice. Sometimes there is no choice. But if you can, ask someone to watch your kids for you, or, ask someone to pick your groceries up for you if you can. Like, those kinds of things are, just try and think of ways to make your life more simplified. And like, it goes back to that like community thing, where it does take a community, because sometimes as adults, we just need help. Sometimes we shouldn't be afraid to ask for help when we can. If we are able to get help from someone, ask. It's the worst thing that's going to happen is they can't, or they say no, or whatever. But it's it's for the benefit of your whole family if you can simplify your life while you're raising your children.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of go back to touch on the whole like knowing yourself, like know your own limits and what you're capable of. And also like when you're reaching your like boiling point and where you're going to step back,
Mhm.
right? And then kind of being like in like leading yourself so that to be a better parent.
Yeah, and I'll bring up my story because I don't mind sharing. But the other day, I was driving my children to their dad's, and my son did something that really upset me because he was just being careless. And so I did kind of blow up on him, not like, you know, like I just was like, I can't, why did this happen? Why did you do that? And he's 13, so raging hormones, whatever is going on in his head. He actually, called me some names because he was really upset with me. And I kind of almost fell into the trap of, getting into a power struggle with him. And so I'm actually currently taking a course from the Institute of Child Psychology about childhood anger, and we're actually looking at the brain and how, brain development is really, really important to understand in terms of like how interactions with children go a lot more smoothly when we understand it. So when my son is in this frustrated, angry state, his amygdala is taking over, and his like higher like brain function in his prefrontal cortex just shuts down completely. So he is not going to hear anything I say, no matter what. If I'm trying to say, I'm upset, I'm not upset that it was an accident. I know it was an accident. That's not what I'm upset about. I'm upset that were being careless again. You know, you weren't paying attention, or, you know, he's not going to hear that. He's just going to hear that he's going to, you know, his own narrative is going on in his mind right now. And that's that my mom's being a B word. So the drive is an hour and a half, and this happened like right as we were leaving. I, you know, stopped myself from engaging in this, and I just went quiet, and we just drove in silence for a really long time. And I waited, and I was being very intentional about it. I knew that I needed for him to calm down first before we could have a meaningful conversation about what happened. And the fact that he called me a name, which I was like, don't ever do that again. I was, you know, you can be angry, but don't insult, don't be calling, you know, resort to name calling. So when we were finally able to speak about it, he, you know, he's like, well, you were blaming me for something that was an accident. And I was like, no, I wasn't. I was, you know, upset that you weren't paying attention. I know it was an accident. And then I took the initiative to apologize. And I said, I'm sorry that I reacted the way that I did. I was just upset because what you did affected your brother. And that's what I'm upset about. And then he still was having some trouble kind of, you know, taking responsibility for his part in it. And I said to him, you know, if you know, it's okay to be upset, but you don't need to resort to name calling and whatnot. So that conversation didn't end there, but we did take a break, and we just, you know, okay, well, this probably isn't the right time. It's still too much in this like emotion part of the brain, like the lower brain. And if anyone's familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel, he'll talk about the hand model of the brain. And then you're like, this is your prefrontal cortex is up here when you're elevated in emotion, and it's this part that's working. When we finally got to his father's, I brought it up, and we talked about it as a family. And I kind of just was like, this is what happened. And then, you know, okay, we'll just let it go for now. In the meantime, I was having a conversation with his dad about something else. He just randomly came up to me and come up and just walked in front of me and gave me a hug. And I looked at his dad, and I was like, there's my apology. So and that took almost over an hour. So I think in times of, you know, the kind of struggle, those elevated emotional situations with our children, we have to give them time. We have to give ourselves time. We have to give them time, and not push this timeline on them. Like, I need to resolve this now. I need to make you know that I was right, or that was unacceptable behavior right now. And I think that's the wrong kind of thinking. I think we really do have to allow the emotions to run their course and wait for the upper part of the brain to come back down, and then have those conversations with our children. And obviously it's going to be developmentally appropriate. If it's a 3-year-old, the language is going to be more simple and plain. But I think it's a really good example of me taking myself back, taking a step back, and realizing that my behavior in this situation is not going to fix it, is not going to resolve it. It's not, and nobody wins in that situation. This isn't like me versus him. Like, it's us. We are a family. We want to be a cohesive unit. So I have to be mindful of how my behavior is going to affect his behavior. And not that he gets a pass for calling me a bad name. Like, you know, he does have to take responsibility for that. But I have to understand what's going on in his brain at that time.
Yeah, for sure. So to kind of like wrap up the childism conversation, do you have like last words about it, or?
I don't have last words. It's a big conversation. There's no last words with regards to childism. But I do think that if anyone really does want to understand it a little better, to, you know, read the article that I'm going to post in the links. If you really do want to, and I will go into detail about Alice Miller another time, but there is a book that you've read some of it. If you really want to learn a little bit more about the psychoanalytical side of childism, you can read Alice Miller's For Your Own Good: Hidden Cruelty in Child Rearing and the Roots of Violence, which is the name of the book. You can find it on Amazon, I think. You can definitely check that out in the meantime. But there's definitely lots of things on the internet. And I think just being mindful of it being mindful and accepting that this is actually something that, is going on, and looking back and seeing, like, and not being, and don't be so hard on yourself as well. Like, I know it's hard for us as parents to admit that we've done something wrong, that, and it's hard because we feel so much guilt sometimes, and we've talked about mom guilt and whatever. But I think we just really have to acknowledge it and admit that we've been guilty of it, but not take it that as, I've ruined my children or I'm a horrible parent. It's just the first step in moving forward, and sort of like, our motto is reframing and refocusing. So I think taking that perspective and accepting that you have been guilty of it, and there's nothing wrong with that, because now you're mindful of it, and you're going to do the steps to go forward and change those things, if you're willing to do the work.
Yeah, awareness is always like that first step. So,
All
right, awesome. And so next week we have
special guest.
Yes, to talk about racism and empathy.
Yeah.
And with children, right?
I'm gonna have to touch base with her, but that is kind of the basis of a lot of the talks that she has within schools. We may want to have some questions prepared, but I think she's wonderful, and she'll have a lot of information and a lot of insight to share with us. Barb is a wonderful person, and I am really looking forward to chatting with her, and I think it's a good way to end Black History Month where we live. It's February, and yeah, I think it's going to have a lot of insightful information, and I'm really looking forward to it.
All right, awesome. I have to unmute it. It takes a while. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.